Welcome back to the second video in this mini-series of the FOIs. Hopefully it gets better with each video, but we'll find out, right? So, Task B of the FOI, again, CFI PTS changes 1 through 6. Task B is going to involve the learning process. And depending on how well I do at teaching this, it'll help explain why you may or may not remember this lesson. So without further ado, let's get started. First thing we want to cover in the PTS is learning theory. So there's a few different theories here. And the first we want to talk about is behaviorism. And behaviorism can be explained as the carrot or the stick. Behaviorism states that humans are going to respond as a result of past punishments or rewards. They're going to use their experience, and that will affect their behavior. So you can infer, a behaviorist would infer that someone is learning that stealing is bad because they're no longer stealing anymore. Maybe a thief had their hand cut off, and they don't steal anymore. So we assume that because they're not stealing anymore, they have learned that thievery is frowned upon in this society. Now the next one we want to cover is cognitive theory. I'm just going to say thoughts. A cognitive theorist would state that the thief hasn't really learned that thievery is bad until they change their thought process around thievery. They change how they feel about stealing. So behaviorism is a way of explaining the outcome matters, whereas cognitive theory states that the thoughts, what's going on in the person's head, is really what matters. Now, cognitive theory has two major branches here. One branch is information processing theory, and the other is constructivism. Say that. So information processing theory is the idea that our brain will work like a computer. So the computer takes all the inputs with a mouse and a keyboard and a webcam and all that fun stuff, and it uses that and it puts it through a program and processes it. Information processing theory views the brain in the same way, where we take our five senses, we take full input from all of them, and we use that to figure out what's going on and how we can change our behavior and learn in the future. Constructivism is going to be the brain using past experiences as a result of interactions to build on each other, and that will create our future thoughts and our future learning. So the best example of this is like the kid with the hot stove. The kid keeps touching the red hot stove, and every time they get burned, and they realize that, red hot metal is hot. And they might take that, and the same student, or the same kid, rather, people have given this example where they get the toy place at the toy kitchenette, and they touch the little red sticker, and they're expecting it to be hot, but it's not. So this would be an example of constructivism, where the kid has built on his past experiences of the red-looking thing being hot, and inferring that the new thing is also going to be the same. That's constructivism. So, past experiences build current thoughts. Information processing, we take all of our senses and use them to evaluate what's in front of us. The thoughts are what matter, and the behavior is what matters. So, let's go ahead and scoot on here. So, no matter which theory that you really subscribe to, it's such a complex field that it's more of a, for us as instructors, it's more important to know this so that we can evaluate our student based on different criteria. Have they changed their thought process around safety, or are they just acting safer because we're in the plane? This might be obviously an important thing to evaluate before we send a student off on a solo. Now, we briefly touched on information processing. Information processing involves the use of the senses. Well, so do perceptions and insights. So, a perception is going to be a note that we realize from one of our five senses. And when we have perceptions that we work and build together, perceptions form meaningful wholes we get insights. So if you just perceive that this metal is kind of hot, that's great. But if you perceive that the metal is hot but the plastic isn't, that might be a meaningful whole. And thus your insight from that can be only metal really gets red hot from the heat. Or maybe the real stove is what gets red hot from that heat. That would be an example of an insight. Now, everyone perceives things differently. I don't know if you've ever had this talk, but people always joke, is my red different than your red? Could be. Very well could be. Now, there are other factors that do affect perception. And no matter whether you want to look at this as G step or step G, or I feel like there's probably another way to look through it, whatever it may be, this is the acronym we can use here. So one factor that affects perception is going to be self-value. Or rather, or self-concept is a better way to put it. How you look at yourself will change how you perceive the world around you. So, people might look at themselves as dumb or stupid and perceive the world around them as this brilliant place full of geniuses, when in reality, they're smart. They just don't realize it. And them being down on themselves is going to influence the way they look at everything around them and how they act on it. If this person thinks they're stupid and everyone around them is a genius, they might just kind of stop paying attention to things and say, you know what, I'm just going to listen to other people because they must always be right. This person is not going to trust themselves as a consequence of this, and this might influence their decisions as PIC. And again, we want to make sure we address this before we send them off on a solo. So self-concept can certainly affect the way that we perceive the world around us. Time and opportunity is another one. So, given enough time, a student will have enough time to perceive what's going on around them and make proper judgments based on it. If you give someone a quick view or a quick overview of something, they might not fully understand it, fully perceive what's happening, and be able to process it and make meaningful wholes from this perception. So, we want to make sure that we give our students enough time to learn. And obviously, though, we want to make sure we don't give them, too much time, because then they're wasting it, time and money, so on and so forth. Next up is element of threat. A student who feels threatened is not going to learn. That same student we were talking about earlier succeeded in turning onto final, cutting off the jet. This is horrible, absolutely horrible. And if you sit there and you try to tell the student as the jet blares over your head, 200 feet because they had to yank back on the control stick to not kill you, as that jet is blasting over the roof of your sky chicken, 50 feet high or whatever, that is not going to be a good time to start yelling at your student saying, hey, this is why we weren't supposed to do that. You just made him go around. We almost died. Blah, 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 blah. They're not listening to you. They are so entirely scared of this ridiculously close flyby in midair, they're not listening to you, and they're not going to learn from this. So making sure that element of threat is not influencing our student at that time that we're trying to teach them is definitely important if we're trying to get a point across. Next up is going to be the physical aspect. Pretty straightforward. If you got a cold and your nose is stopped up, can you smell a gas leak in the plane? Actually, more important, if you got a cold and your nose is stopped up, why on earth are you going up in the plane in the first place? That aside, these types of things are going to prohibit you, or inhibit you rather, from experiencing the world around you. Someone who's deaf, like I said, might not be able to hear you from behind your mask because they've normally been reading your lips to understand your words. Physical aspect can definitely affect how we perceive the world around us. And finally, goals and values. If we have a student, two students, right? Each of them are working on their private pilot. They're both student pilots. They're just killing the game. One student wants to become an airline pilot. The other student just wants his private. He just wants to putt around the area, get his private license. Maybe he'll buy a Dr. Killer one day. Who knows? But anyways, one student wants to become this really big shot pilot. He wants to fly, a 7.4 for, actually, no one really flies 7.4s anymore. It's a shame. But, he wants to fly a wide body for Delta, or whatever it's going to be. The other student doesn't really care, doesn't really matter that much. The first student understands that to meet his goal to become a Delta pilot, he's got to be a good darn pilot. He's got to be on top of his stuff, and he knows that after this private license, he's getting his instrument rating. And after that, he's getting his commercial license. And he knows when he gets his commercial license, all of the criterion for the maneuvers, the elements are going to be a little bit more strict. So that student is going to be a lot more worried about making his landing spot on. That student is going to be a lot more worried about keeping his checklist spot on. And when you tell him these things, he'll pay attention. Whereas the student who maybe just kind of wants to hop in his plane and putt around on the weekends probably doesn't really care that much. He's going to perceive your bringing this up as not so important, whereas the other student might perceive this importance a lot higher. The goal and value can absolutely influence the outcome of how the student views the scenario in front of them. So let's go ahead and erase this here. Now those are perceptions and insights. Now, from these perceptions and insights, we need to talk about acquiring knowledge. So we've taken these perceptions, we've formed them into meaningful wholes and created insights from them. These insights will help us with our knowledge. Now, there's different stages of knowledge acquisition that we need to understand, and for this we can use MUC. This is memory, understanding, and concept learning. Same students, same scenario. We're talking about learning. The first step of this is going to be having them memorize the landing profile. We're going to show them and say, hey, on the downwind, you're at 90 knots and a beam to point of touchdown. Make sure we're going to establish an 80 knot descent and flaps 10. They're going to follow the rest of the pattern. They're going to learn that. This student might not be able to tell you exactly why they're doing it, but they've memorized it. This is the first step in learning it. The next step is understanding it. This typically comes as a result of experience. So a student is going to properly understand why they pitch for that 80 knot descent, that's 70 on base, and that's 65 on final. Instead of just saying, all right, we're going to do this and follow the pattern, they understand that they don't do these things. Their approach is going to be unstabilized, and so their landing is going to be doo-doo. Finally, concept learning. So these are going to be, the student is going to take this idea and apply it to other things. So finally, the student fully understands the reason why they're doing this, and they can apply it maybe to straight descents or something like that, where they understand that if they want to end up on a certain altitude, they can't just be willy-nilly and descend at 600 feet a minute, 200 feet a minute, 1,500 feet a minute, back down to 400 feet a minute, when they're only trying to descend maybe 200 feet, right? So they're not going to be able to roll out on that nice smooth altitude like they would roll out on that flare if they don't follow a nice stabilized descent procedure. So these are going to be the three stages of knowledge acquisition. Now, let's erase this real quick here. Taking a step back to the broader picture, students aren't going to learn if certain criteria are not met. Now, we previously discussed Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and we've got a new name. E.L. Thorndike. Might have misspelled it, but it's okay. We got the point across. E.L. Thorndike created the laws of learning. And this, according to him, is a student will not learn unless X, Y, Z. So, for the laws of learning, we use Weber. Law of readiness. Law of, there we go, I did it again. Exercise. Law of effect, primacy, intensity, and recency. So, what does this all mean? The law of readiness states that a student who is not ready to learn won't learn. So, I love the example of, again, it's pretty simple. I mean, think back to elementary school, right? You didn't want to sit there all day and learn. You want to go out and have fun at recess. So you have to find a way to motivate your students, make sure they're ready to learn. And if they're not ready to learn, figure out why they're not. See what you can do to motivate them. See if there's any barriers in their life that are kind of preventing them from feeling ready to learn. The next law is the law of exercise. Things that are most often repeated are best remembered. So, use it or lose it is the best way I like to remember it. You know, I took, back in high school, I took Calc 1 and Calc 2 my senior year. It's been about 3 years since I graduated, and I actually had someone ask me a pre-calculus question, I want to say about 8 months ago. I had no clue what I was looking at. And this is something that I previously would have kind of laughed at. It would have been pretty simple, pretty easy, would have just blown right through it. And because I haven't used these principles in 3 years, I don't remember them. So that would be the law of exercise. The law of effect states that learning is strengthened when you are accompanying it with a positive feeling, and learning is weakened when accompanied with a negative. So this is important because we don't want to overwhelm our students in the first day. We all know that aside from it being illegal, we all know that if you toss the student in as a solo on their first day, and you're like, yeah, man, go take off, go have fun, they're probably going to crash the plane before they even take it off, because let's be real, no one knows properly how to steer with their feet on the first day. This is going to probably scar the student, aside from the crash itself, and they're not going to want to learn anymore. That's a negative experience. So our job as an instructor with this is to make sure we set our students up for success and let them build off of previous successes. These previous successes are going to allow our students to learn and continue to be successful, so on and so forth. It's kind of like a feedback loop in a lot of ways. Set your student up for success from the beginning, and it will continue long beyond through their life once they're past your instruction. On the note of setting them up for success, the law of primacy states that things learned first are going to be the strongest that they remember. So the first thing your student learns is going to be what sticks with them through life. So if you tell your student something that's completely wrong, they will probably continue to do that for a long, long time. And if they do ever shake it, it is going to be very difficult for them to shake it. So as instructors, it's our responsibility to make sure we teach students correct information, and information that's definitely helpful for them, that doesn't have any conflicting thoughts on the subject matter. The law of intensity is pretty straightforward. It states that there's really no substitute for the real thing. Sure, you could do maneuvers and learn flows in a simulator, but ground reference maneuvers, good luck with that. Good luck doing a turn around a point looking sideways out of your non-existent computer monitor. It's pretty difficult, and it's not as helpful as just going up in the plane and doing it. Same thing with landings and feeling out ground effects. Sure, you can do plenty of landings in a sim, but are they going to be effective and smooth, and are they going to help you in the actual aircraft? Probably not. So, law of intensity is the real thing is the best thing. The law of recency. Things learned recently are best remembered. So, I talked about law of exercise versus law of recency earlier. Exercise meaning use it or lose it. Recency meaning most recent is best remembered. So, the law of recency will indicate that if I jump back into learning how to solve those pre-calculus problems, it's probably going to be a lot harder for me than to jump back into those calculus or calculus 2 problems. Because Cal and Cal 2 were subjects that I took within the last 2 or 3 years, whereas pre-Cal was in the last 3 or 4. Things learned recently are best remembered. Quick recap. Recent is best remembered. No substitute for the real thing. Learn it first, learn it right. Positive reinforces learning, negative disenfranchises your student. Use it or lose it. And if your student's not ready to learn, they will not learn. These are going to be the laws of learning, E.L. Thorndike's. Sorry about that pause there. The E.L. Thorndike's laws of learning. Now, we figured out what brings our student to learn and helps them learn. Let's understand how they actually learn by discussing the domains of learning. The first domain of learning is the cognitive domain of learning. Cognitive. This is going to be the knowledge level of learning. This is going to be typically educational objectives. So maybe reading about systems, attending ground school, pre-flight briefings, understanding processes behind communications. This is going to be everything that's up in your head. I mean, this all is, but you don't understand. It's pure knowledge. The affective domain has to do with beliefs and values that a student holds. Does your student really have a good attitude towards safety, or do they just do it because you're in the plane? Making sure that your student in the affective domain fully subscribes to what they're learning is super important. Because again, I don't want to sign off a student on a solo who really doesn't care about using his checklist. Because it sounds to me like this kid is going to stall the plane out somewhere in the pattern, because they're going to run out of fuel or something crazy like that. So I don't want to deal with that at all. Make sure your student is completely on board with learning, has a good attitude towards it. And finally, we have the I think I missed an S in that. Yeah, I did. Psychomotor domain. And the psychomotor domain is going to be where a student is going to be applying it's a complex group of different ideas. So they might be flying an ILS. So they have to understand how the ILS works, right? They have to understand the importance of it and subscribe to wanting to use it instead of just sending it on a heading in IMC. And then the psychomotor domain is the combination of these skills. It's going to be the hand-eye coordination as well as the knowledge behind it. Maybe they're programming the G1000. They're going through the flight plan, and they have to remember they don't just insert a leg before, they have to activate a leg, or something along those lines. So these are going to be the domains of learning. Now, we move on. We want to talk about characteristics of learning. So these are the domains, and this is kind of how learning is segregated in the mind. Let's talk about learning itself. So learning, the whole learning process is going to be purposeful, experiential. It's going to be multifaceted, and it is going to be an active process. So, let's talk about what this means. Learning is purposeful. We have to have a reason to learn. If there's no reason to learn, we're not going to learn. We just won't. So give the learning a purpose. Don't just tell the student we're going to learn this to learn it. Give them a reason behind it. This needs to be, again, it helps keep our students on board with the process here, and we don't lose them. Learning is experiential. Students learn from experience, trial and error. Got to practice it over and over and over again. A lot of people will say, when they get through their CFI, they learn more from their first and second students than they do from the entire ground process. I don't know about that, but we'll find out, that's for sure. It's going to be an experiential process. We take what we've done, we process that information, and we learn from it. Learning is multifaceted. If someone tried to give me a ground lesson on how an ILS works and the components of an ILS in the aircraft during my instrument rating, it would be a wild, wild time. We want to make sure that we have different areas for different types of learning. We learn on the ground, we learn in the plane, maybe we listen to a podcast in the car, we talk to a weather briefer. We learn in a multitude of different ways. This is the multifaceted aspect of learning. Finally, learning is an active process. If your student is not on board with the process, they won't learn. You got to make sure your student is actively responding. You're not just going to lecture at them like they're a brick wall. Your student is a sponge. So figure out how active they can be, and by keeping your student active and keeping your student involved in the process, you as the instructor can help understand, or you as the instructor can understand when it's time to stop and when it's time to keep going. Keep your student active throughout the process, keeps them motivated, keeps them engaged, and helps you as an instructor better understand whether to continue or stop for the day. Now, in acquiring skill knowledge, so we've figured out characteristics of learning. More specifically, skill knowledge matters because as a pilot, we have a multitude of different skills that we have to understand. And understanding how the student acquires knowledge of those skills will help us teach them. Surprise, surprise. So if hearing the word cognitive is a surprise for you today, get that out of your head because cognitive pops up 10 million times in this task. Cognitive stage, associative stage, and automatic response stage. These are the stages of skill acquisition. So, first stage of skill acquisition is the cognitive stage. I love the example for skill acquisition of diving. I don't know about you, but I like cliff jumping. I like diving. I think it's fun, but I'm a bit of a wuss, and I'm a cap us out at like 20 feet max. Professional divers go a lot higher than that. I've seen people shoot 50, 60, 70 feet, and honestly, I'm convinced if I did that, I would actually drown. So we wouldn't do that. But in the world of professional diving, the first stage, well, in any profession here, right? But the first stage of skill acquisition is the cognitive stage. This is memorizing the steps to a skill. This is going to be understanding the process of what you're doing. So maybe we're talking about the mechanics of the dive, the physics of the fall, the speed you'll fall at. I don't know why I wrote physicals. The physics. I can't write today. There we go. The mechanics, the physics, and I don't know. There's probably some other stuff in there. You understand what you do. All right, I'm walking up to the board. I'm jumping off. We're going to start with like a pencil, and then we'll work to like a regular dive, and then we'll start adding in flips. It's learning the concepts behind what you're doing, but you're not really quite doing it yet. The associative stage is going to be practicing. You begin to start associating different actions that you're doing with outcomes in the process. You're realizing that, ooh, I over-rotated on that one and landed on my belly from 30 feet up. That one hurt. I'm not over-rotating again. Through practice of the skill, the student is going to start improving on that skill and becoming better. Finally, the automatic response skill, or stage of skill acquisition, is going to allow the student to focus on other aspects of the skill instead of just the primary basis of it. So maybe, we'll say perfection. So maybe this student is no longer working on just trying not to belly flop. They're working on making their form flawless as they come off of the board. This is a student who doesn't really have to do a full, thoughtful evaluation because they know exactly where it went wrong. This is someone who is so experienced in the process they can correct for these issues without undergoing a full-on critique or process through self-evaluation. Beginning stage, middle stage, end stage. Cognitive, associative, automatic response, the stages of skill acquisition. Now, if our student as our student acquires skills, well, they have to practice. And, of course, there are a few different types of practice. Let's talk about those. The first type of practice is going to be blocked practice. Blocked practice is, if you remember, you think back to elementary school when you're doing maybe the spelling practice and you just have to sit there and write the word over and over and over again for your spelling bee, for your homework. That is an example of blocked practice. You are just doing and doing and doing and doing. Or maybe the times tables. You remember those sheets? They would have different sections in the sheet, and then each one would be like 7 times 7 and like 6 times 7 and then 5 times 7 and whatever it would be, like, right? You'd have different things. You have to solve them as quick, and then, whoever did the most blocks would like get a lollipop or something. I don't know. That's blocked practice. Blocked practice is doing the same thing over and over and over and over and over again until it just becomes this quick, rote, automatic response. Deliberate practice is similar in the manner of doing this item over and over again, but there's restrictions on it here. We're not focused on achieving necessarily this kind of quick, rote outcome. Our goal with deliberate practice is to achieve a goal and provide feedback to the student and give in my opinion, it's one of the best ways of these two to practice, right? Because block practice is going to be for that quick response, you don't even think about it, and deliberate practice is actually understanding the ins and outs of the skill and understanding what you're doing, how it affects the outcome. So deliberate practice is going to involve feedback, typically from your instructor, of course, and we work with it from there. Finally, random practice. Random practice is going to be mixing up all of our skills that we've worked on, and it's going to be random, pretty obvious. Where instead of maybe going out to the practice area every time and on the way out to the practice area, the instructor goes, "Oh no, the engine went out, what do we do?" The instructor might say, "Man, oh God, I don't feel well. Oh man, I feel really, really sick." Or, that smells kind of funny. Or the engine kind of sounds like it's running a little bit rough. Do you hear that noise? Giving the student different scenarios and different ideas and different orders of the practice helps more firmly cement these concepts into their head. So if you keep telling the student the same thing every time, that's all they learn. Whereas if you randomize the order or randomize what we're covering, it helps them actually understand the concept instead of just understanding the one item. So those are the types of practice. Now, I just said the S word a minute ago, being scenario. Scenario is the S word. I don't know what you were thinking. So, scenario-based training. Scenario-based training is going to allow the student to train for the real world. I kind of have a personal thing about this. Scenario-based training, in my opinion, shouldn't have to be called scenario-based training. It should just be called training. Because if we as instructors are training our students for the training environment, we're doing them a disservice. Because I don't know about you, but when I have a student who makes it through their check ride, I plan on them, doing their own thing. I don't plan on flying with them for the rest of their life. If they want to come back to me and do a flight review, that's great. But other than that, they're on their own and they are flying in the real world. They're not flying with me and they're not flying in the training environment. They're flying real life scenarios. So, scenario-based training is going to be us training our students for real life flying. Now, a good scenario has a good set of objectives. It's tailored to the student, and it is tailored to the environment. First part of our SBT, a good set of objectives means that we're not going to just throw a student into a scenario and they're going to sit there and be like, well, what am I trying to do here? The goal is to survive, right? The goal is to get the plane safely on the ground and no one dies and everyone goes home and has a great night. Make sure we give them a proper outcome for this scenario. Your goal is to get us safely on the ground. Your goal is to get us to this airport. Your goal is to stretch this fuel however we can do it. Your goal is to keep the electricity, keep our battery charged as long as we can because we're an IMC. Give them a good set of objectives. The next part of our good SBT is tailor it to the student. Again, I don't know about you, but I'm not putting a third-day private pilot student, I'm not giving them a scenario where they're engine out in the traffic pattern. Because this student probably doesn't even really know how to land the plane on the third lesson, let alone try to perform a power-off 180. Now, as a private student further along, maybe just before his check ride, I will give him engine out in the traffic pattern practice. I will do that. They will lose their engine and be in the point of touchdown. And I won't hold them to commercial standards, but I'm going to give them that engine out, and they better land it on the runway. Make sure you tailor the problems you give your students to your students' level of experience. Don't overwhelm them. Again, the law of effect. Next, has to be tailored to the environment. Giving a students, in the plains or the desert, maybe not the desert, there's certain mountainous areas in the desert, but if you give a student in the plains a scenario in regards to mountain obscuration, they don't really care. Because they lived in Kansas their whole life, and they're not going to deal with mountains, so why do they care? Why does it matter? Whereas if you gave a student in North Georgia the same situation, they might value it differently. A student who's flying out of DeKalb Peachtree Airport in Atlanta can fly south and can fly towards the ocean and no terrain, or they can very well fly north into the Appalachians, which reach upwards of 4, 5, 6,000 feet in some places. So make sure you tailor the examples to the environment around the students. Again, keeping everything relatable to the student, keeping it fresh, helps keep them motivated and keeps them interested in what they're doing. So that's scenario-based training, or in my opinion, what all training really should be. Now, sometimes when students go through these scenarios or other training, they make errors. What types of errors, you might ask? Well, they can make slips and they can make mistakes. Beautiful. So a slip is when a student plans to do the right thing, but inadvertently does the incorrect thing. A mistake is when the student actually tries to do the wrong thing and then ends up doing it anyways. So a slip is, oops, I accidentally pulled the mixture as I reached for the throttle. A mistake is going to be, you misjudge the wind, and you decide that the correct runway to land on is actually the runway with the tailwind. You make the approach for that runway, and you land on that runway with the tailwind. That would be an example of a mistake. Now, how can we work to reduce these errors? Well, we can take our time, right? Don't rush the process. Don't let get-there-itis affect you. Don't rush the process. Take your time. We can learn and we can practice these issues. So if we continually make errors in terms of wind direction, and we keep making mistakes and picking the wrong runway, I'm going to give my students some deliberate practice, and we're going to sit down and just start giving them wins. And I'm going to start saying, yep, you've got, what do we got? 1, 0, 3. I think that's it. Hang on. I can't think today. We're going to make it easy. 1, 8, 3, 6. And we just start giving them wins. 1, 8, 3, 6. Cool. We got wins from 2, 7, 0. We got wins from 1, 8, 0. We got wins from 0, 1, 0. Start figuring out what runway you're going to land on for each of them. So we're going to work with that. We're going to do learning. We're going to do practice. Of course, we want to check for errors. This is hugely important. I mean, we have checklists for a reason. So check your work. When you get an altimeter, make sure you've put it into the system and check and make sure it's been put in properly. Make sure you didn't just put in 3010 and you accidentally put in, 3001, right? Check for these types of errors. Now, to help with this, we can use reminders. Typically, we'd call those checklists. And raising awareness to common errors, we can talk to our students about what people typically do. And again, going back to instrument training, I always remember the way we work through this with like hold entries, and my teacher or my instructor would go through different types of hold entries and common errors. They'd say, well, yeah, typically people mix up parallel entries and teardrops when they're on the line. So we worked with that, and we talked about it, and we understood that this is the correct outcome for that hold entry. Now, how do we recover from error? Well, first things first, it's a great opportunity to teach. We want to talk to our students when they make a mistake or a slip, and talk to them about it and say, hey, this just happened. Did you catch it? What are we going to do about it? What are the outcomes of this issue? And if it's a really severe one, we absolutely can use that as an opportunity to teach. If a student is about to make a runway incursion and we have to slam on the brakes, if they don't understand the vast importance of this incursion and the safety implications it involves, tell them about it. Now is the best time when they're sitting there and you slam on the brakes and 2 seconds later a jet comes roaring past you on the main runway. That is a great moment to talk about runway incursions and why they need to make sure they keep track of where they are and what the calls are and write everything down. Great opportunities to teach from. Now, how do we avoid these to begin with? We talked about using some techniques to avoid them, but let's kind of talk about using our brain and using memory to help with this. The best thing we can do is to understand actually how our memory works and then work backwards. So, 3 types of memory: sensory, short-term, and long-term. Sensory memory is going to be a quick, fleeting flash. Ooh, that was a loud noise. Oh, it's really hot. Ooh, this smells kind of funny. Done. If that memory is of any importance, it moves on to short term. So if that memory has any real importance, oh, ground just spoke to me. I can hear the noises coming from my headset. It's ground speaking to me. Goes into short-term memory. Short-term memory then pauses, waits, and listens to what they say. Ideally, you write down ground's clearances. Taxi north on Alpha, whatever it is. Hold short. 35 right. Alpha 8. Whatever it is. You put it in the short-term memory, and hopefully you write it down, runaway incursion. Anyways, you put it in that short-term memory, and it's there. If this becomes a big scenario, something that really matters, your brain deems of higher importance, it moves into long-term memory. Gumps. Again, talking about that law of primacy, it's never coming out of my head. Gumps check. But, actually rather, BC Gumps is what I was taught, which is funny because I've never flown a boosted or carbureted plane. But anyways, BC Gumps. It's my burn into my long-term memory. It was the first traffic pattern checklist that I learned, and it'll be the last because it'll never leave my memory. BC Gumps is in my long-term memory, and it's been burned in there. Boost pump, carb heat, gas undercarriage, mixture prop, seatbelt switches. That is burned in there. Long-term memory is something that your brain deems of enough importance that it stays in there long-term. So, those are going to be the three types of memory here. Now, how can we make sure that we retain this learning? Well, praise is a good one. So this is our race app. So, attitudes, praise. Give me a quick sec here. I'm just trying to remember this here. Association. This is recall. No, it's we involve our senses. And then repetition. There we go. Took a quick sec here. So, first things first, we repeat different things. Sounds like a law of exercise to me, doesn't it? So, repetition, we want to make sure we repeat certain things. If we have an altimeter setting, we say, all right, 3010, we read it back to ATC, and then we put it in the thing. We put it in the box. We say 3010 in the Colson window. And we put it into their G1000, we say 3010. And we make sure that we repeat things, because also it helps our partner for someone else in the aircraft. Recall is promoted by association. For me personally, creating a story around a concept is so much better than just remembering the concept itself. If you remember that something happened as you were learning something, or someone is trying to remind you, say, hey, don't you remember when he said this? And you're sitting there and you're not quite sure, and like, oh my God, you're right, he said that because as he said that, the football team on the TV behind him, scored and everyone in the bar went crazy. Something like that is going to be recall promoted by association. Creating a whole memory and a whole story helps with people. Involving the senses with that same story. You remember hearing the people scream, and you remember the smell of someone spilling a beer, and you remember the smell of food walking past you, and you see, you watch the crazy score that happened behind the dude. All of these different senses are going to remind you of what happened in that bar when this dude said whatever he said. Now, attitudes also help with remembering things. Again, going back to the law of effect here. Positive scenario, positive outcome helps you remember it. If we've got a good attitude, because we're like, damn, that was a really great flight, and I remember that, and it was so much fun, that positive effect, that attitude associated with it, is going to help this person remember whatever they were learning that day. Finally, praise. Same deal along the lines of attitude. If they had a great day, and they remember it's a great day, and they remember the loving learning, and they also remember you being like, man, you just crushed that. That was a great flight. They're going to have, or your student is going to have a much better time remembering the contents of that lesson than otherwise. Now, when these things go bad, or sometimes they go right and people just forget things, we need to talk about the ways in which they forget. This is FIRRS, the types of forgetting. There's fading, interference, we'll say recall failure for this one, so that way I can line up repression and suppression next to each other, because people mix them up all the time. So, first step is fading. It's just an old memory that just kind of fades into the background. It's kind of fuzzy. You can't quite remember, but you understand what happened. It's a faded memory. Interference is going to be other similar memories interfering with that original one. A great example of this is just after you do a lesson with a student 3 or 4 times in a week, and you think back and you're like, man, we did 3 cross countries. What day did we go to Fort Collins? I don't quite remember what day we went there. That might be interference. The one person says, no, yesterday was Fort Collins, and the instructor says, no, it must have been Tuesday. It must have been the day before. That is an example of interference. Similar memories, people aren't quite remembering the details because they interfere with one another. Recall failure. This kills me. Every time I try to think of this specific one, I have a recall failure, ironically. I just straight up forget what it's called. I know that information. I know 100% that this is recall failure, but I just blank. Recall failure, the best way to explain it is just it's on the tip of your tongue. You know it, you just can't recall it. Finally, we have repression and suppression. In Task A, we talked about repression being a defense mechanism where the brain subconsciously decides that you don't need to remember this anymore. If that's repression, suppression is a conscious measure. So, sometimes people their brain represses memories. Typically, this is going to be a traumatic event, something that's really scary, and their brain just decides, you know what, it's safer that you don't remember this anymore. Suppression is going to be a person who is just, they don't want to let that feeling get out. They don't want to let that memory out, so they suppress it on purpose. This is someone who might have had a bad flight, and they're like, you know what, I'm just going to forget about that. I'm just going to pretend that never even happened. They consciously say that becomes suppression. Understand that repression is subconscious and suppression is a conscious way of forgetting things. Finally, I'd like to talk about the transfer of learning. So we have 2 different types of transfers. There's a positive transfer and a negative transfer. To start off, a transfer of learning is going to be when one idea is carried over to another person, as similar as it possibly can be to the original idea. So we don't want this idea to change at all. So to start off, positive transfer learning is going to be using, skill A helps B. And negative is skill A hurts B. So, a positive transfer of learning is maybe sitting down and working on, or not sitting down, we're in the plane and we're doing slow flight, right? And we understand that this slow flight, really feeling out the airplane when it's just above stall, is going to help us with our short field landings. We're just dragging it in ground effect. We're just at our stall speed. We're trying to float it out. We're trying to feel it out. We're not trying to pitch up. These help each other. They work with each other. A negative transfer might be, the classic example, is learning to drive in a car, steering with your hands, and then hopping into a plane and steering with your feet on the ground. This is the classic example of negative transfer of learning. You learn that skill in the car, and unfortunately, the skill in the car is hurting you in regards to the skill in the plane. So positive, negative, pretty straightforward. We want to make sure that we build off of information that we've learned to help us with new stuff. We want to make sure that we're not teaching students contradictory information that's going to invoke a negative transfer of learning for a new task. So let's go back through everything and make sure we covered it. We've covered positive and negative transfers of learning. We've covered retention of learning with RACEAP. Memory and forgetting, FIRS, F-I-R-R-S. Slips and mistakes being our errors. Scenario-based training, making sure that we apply everything to our student and the area and we give them good objectives. Random, blocked, and deliberate practice. Skill acquisition, which will be cognitive, associative, and automatic response. The characteristics of learning, PEMA. Domains of learning, being our cognitive, our affective, and psychomotor. Oh, real quick cover on that one. I'm so sorry. We have got rote, understanding, application, and correlation. I did it again the third time. Understanding, application, correlation. These are the levels of cognitive learning. Rote is going to be going through the checklist, boost pump, carb heat, gas undercarriage, mixture, props, switches, and seatbelts. They just say it. They don't know why they're doing it. Understanding is actually understanding the importance of why you're doing something. Applying it is applying it to the rest of the pattern and saying, all right, I've got to do these things. I understand why I do them, so I will do them. And finally, correlation for this example would be saying, if my BC Gumps check is super important in the pattern, I'm pretty sure that my descent checklist when I'm 10 miles out from the airport are also important, or my cruise checklist is also important. It's drawing conclusions from the item itself. These are the different levels of cognitive theory. Most people stop at understanding. Or correction, most stop in application, not understanding. Most instructors will make sure their student gets the rote, make sure they understand. Then once the student starts doing the thing, the instructors stop. They don't draw connections, they don't draw correlations between this item and other items. So, just a side note there. Just want to make sure I actually cover that and cover everything here in our PTS. We've covered E.L. Thorndike's Laws of Learning with Reaper. Knowledge acquisition, Muck. Perceptions, how perceptions forming meaningful wholes will become insights. And finally, behaviorism, cognitive theory, constructivism, and information processing theory. So that was Task B of the FOI, referring to the learning process. Up next, we'll be covering Task C in the following videos, so stay tuned for that. Thanks.